Good evening, everybody. Breaking news here tonight. President Obama, the president who so desperately wants to close the Guantanamo Bay Detention Center, is now acting unilaterally, trying to open up all of Cuba. President Obama talking yesterday with Cuban leader Raul Castro on the telephone for 45 minutes. It is, we're told, the first communication at the presidential level in more than a half century. And with the Congress and Senate now out of Washington for the holidays, the president chose today to announce that he's loosening the Cuban embargo unilaterally and seeking to normalize relations with a nation that is still on the list of state sponsors of terrorism alongside Iran, Syria, and Sudan.
I've instructed Secretary Kerry to immediately begin discussions with Cuba to reestablish diplomatic relations that have been severed since January of 1961. Going forward, the United States will reestablish an embassy in Havana, and high-ranking officials will visit Cuba. Where we can advance shared interests, we will.
President Obama also insisting that American citizen Alan Gross was released from a Cuban prison for humanitarian reasons and not in another controversial prisoner swap like the Taliban deal with Sergeant Bo Bergdahl. President Obama made the claim despite his decision to release 3 Cuban spies who were convicted of espionage on American soil on the very same day. The Cuban government did acknowledge the release of a Cuban-born American spy as well. Mr. Gross was surrounded by politicians instead of doctors as he arrived at Andrews Air Force Base, and he sounded very much like a man who's been isolated for 5 years in a communist prison cell.
In my last letter to President Obama, I wrote that despite my 5-year tenure in captivity, I would not want to trade places with him, and I certainly wouldn't want to trade places with him on this glorious day. 5 years of isolation notwithstanding.
The criticism of the president's latest unilateral action not only coming from Republicans, but also top Democrats on both the House Foreign Affairs and Senate Foreign Relations committees. They blasted the president for sending a weak and confusing message to our enemies around the world.
It crosses our own red line once again. I hope when the new Congress convenes that the new incoming chair of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Bob Corker of Tennessee, who I've served with the last 2 years as I've been the chairman, will call for hearings on what is one of the most dramatic changes in U.S. foreign policy anywhere in the world at this time.
We'll be taking all of this up here tonight with the first Cuban-American elected to the U.S. Senate. Senator Mel Martinez is here. We'll also be joined by the former ambassador to Argentina and Nicaragua, Lino Gutierrez, a career diplomat and Cuban-American. And the niece of civil rights leader Martin Luther King is with us tonight to discuss the president's charges of racism against the entire nation. And there is breaking news in the Sony hacking scandal tonight. The FBI says they have found the source and will name that source. That's coming up here tonight as well. Our first guest tonight was 15 years old when he came to this country from Cuba as part of Operation Pedro Pan, a humanitarian program that helped Cuban children escape communist Cuba. Joining us now is Mel Martinez, the first Cuban-American to serve in the Senate, also serving as Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in President George W. Bush's administration. Great to have you with us, Senator, Mr. Chairman. I could go through a long list of honorifics. It's great to have you here.
Thank you. It's great to be with you tonight.
Your reaction to this unilateralism again on the part of the president?
Well, it's so wrong on so many levels. You call it unilateral action. This was done without any consultation with the Congress. It was done just and done and done. You know, I would not agree with a prisoner swap because, frankly, that is what happened in the case of Alan Gross. He was wrongly imprisoned. Secretary of State Kerry just a few weeks ago before the Congress said that there was no equivalence between what those Cuban spies had done, for which they were serving convictions that involve even the death of Americans, and what Alan Gross had done. There is no equivalence. But to do that, you could understand it, you wouldn't agree with it, but to then go ahead and give away the store, to go ahead and change dramatically U.S. foreign policy, after a half a century and getting nothing in return? I mean, that's just unthinkable. The leverage of the embargo, and it's not really an embargo, it was trade sanctions against Cuba, because we trade with Cuba in plenty of goods, agricultural products and other things. So the leverage that the remaining portions of this trade sanctions had was lost completely today by just a unilateral cave, a complete give in to the Cuban government, getting totally nothing in return, and not advancing the opportunity for the Cuban people to live in freedom in the future. That's the one thing that just makes me so sad, because, you know, I still have family in Cuba who yearn to live in freedom. And why shouldn't they? That's the aspiration of every person. And this today was made more difficult by the actions of this president.
Is there an equivalency of some sort, morally, ethically, politically, between our trade with another communist nation, a huge, tremendous society and economy in the People's Republic of China, and that of Castro's Cuba?
Well, a lot of people talk about that equivalence. In fact, the president mentioned that today. I really don't think that that applies. Cuba has been a thorn at the U.S. side for so long. It's a very close neighbor. There are tremendous dangers that arise about our neighbor being so close to us. We saw this graphically during the Cuban Missile Crisis when we were about to invade Iraq. And I was in the cabinet at that time. We had a Cuban spy operating in the State Department. We had to root that person out. It wasn't in the State Department, take that back, in the Department of Defense. And this was a tremendous spy case. This person had been spying for Cuba for over 15 to 20 years. The person's serving a prison sentence today. Cuba was communicating intelligence information because of their proximity to us, to the regime of Saddam Hussein before we invaded Iraq back in 2003. So recently Cuba was involved in an arms trade with North Korea, putting MiG airplanes through the Panama Canal, hidden under a cargo ship. I mean, this is a country that is still on the list of terrorist countries. I presume now they'll unilaterally again take them off the list. But that doesn't mean that the Cubans' actions don't put them in a different category from the way that China behaves towards the United States and the way that, frankly, Vietnam might behave towards the United States. It's a very different relationship.
Is it your judgment, as we watch a new Senate led by the Republican Party come into town in January, that we're going to see an effort to roll back this president's unilateralism and his approach to even those who agree with the idea of working out a new relationship with Cuba? Certainly they would not agree with this unilateral approach, waiting to the first day that Congress is no longer in Washington.
I know it's remarkable to do it on this particular day. You know, my successor in the Senate, Marco Rubio, has already said today that they will be looking at what can be done. But you know, Lou, I fear that with so many other unilateral executive actions, there really is little that can be done. You can do some things, but it's going to be on the margins. The boldness of this policy, the complete change, you know, they might not fund an embassy in Cuba, but you've lost the moment. You've lost the opportunity for leverage, the opportunity for negotiations. You know, we had talked about things like this in terms of quid pro quos, in terms of unilateral, I mean, not unilateral, but bilateral steps. We would take some steps, they would take some steps. That's how you negotiate with a foreign country, is you do some things, you ask them in good faith to do others. We asked the Cuban government to do absolutely nothing. They freed, I think it's 53 Cubans today that were in prison. They'll rearrest them next week if they want to. I mean, they have complete control over the island. And the Cuban people are no freer today, no closer to freedom. The United States is no closer to having a reliable neighbor in Cuba than we were before all of this was done. So it's, I think, a very sad day for U.S. foreign policy, because, again, it shows a very weak foreign policy. It is like withdrawing the missile defense from Eastern Europe without consultation with our allies. You know, it's just not a good thing to do, to show weakness in the light of a regime that continues to be on the list of terrorist states with some very unsavory characters, as you pointed out in the opening of your show.
Senator, always good to talk with you. Thanks for being with us. Senator Mel Martinez.
Thanks, Lou.